Well, welcome to the last in this series of Planet Possible. We hope you've enjoyed listening, and we're delighted to bring you a fantastic episode to close out this season. A huge thanks, first of all, to Scube, who've been our season sponsor for Season 4. Our sponsors are crucial in enabling us to bring Planet Possible to you, and we're really grateful for their support. I'm Niki Roach, and alongside being a passionate advocate for all things water and environment, I'm a fellow of CIWEM, the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management. Our members in over 90 countries are professionals with a breadth and depth of expertise in the topics that are shaping the future of our planet. So in today's episode, we've done something a bit different. We've taken Planet Possible on location. In a minute, we're going to head to Spain's Hall Estate in the southeast of England to find out how they're managing their land a little differently, including with the introduction of some pairs of beavers. We're going to be discussing the connection between land, water and food production, and hearing in practice what alternative approaches are being planned at scale. So to help us unpick this topic, I'm joined by a superb co-host and someone who by now is a familiar voice to regular listeners, CIWEM's Director of Policy, Alistair Chisholm. Welcome back, Al. It's great to have you with us.
Hi again, Niki. Thanks for having me again.
It's a pleasure. Al and I both travelled to Essex to meet our guest and see firsthand the work he's delivering. So Al is the perfect co-host to help provide a bit of wider context on the impact and the challenges of this type of pretty groundbreaking activity. So in a moment, we'll listen to our guest interview together and then we'll discuss our reflections. So our guest interview today is with Archie Ruggles-Brise, and Archie is the 11th generation of the Ruggles-Brise family to take the helm since they purchased Spain's Hall in 1760. In his role as estate manager, he's reshaped the direction of the estate towards a much more nature-first approach, and he's repurposing the land towards a really environmentally sustainable future. Archie's a chartered water and environment manager, a trustee of the Essex and Suffolk Rivers Trust, and amongst many other roles is a climate change panel member of the Country, Land and Business Association, and advisor to both the Essex Climate Action Commission and Essex Local Nature Partnership. And I was really interested to hear how open Archie was about why he's taking this approach at Spain's Hall.
We think about things in multi-generation. So I'm looking at, what is the next generation going to be left with? What are the challenges they're going to face? And for me, the challenge of climate change and the challenge of the biodiversity crisis and the challenge of getting people excited about where they live and keeping people in our local community are things that I really think we need to do something about.
So Al, you and I visited Spain's Hall together for the pod. So before we hear the interview with Archie and share the visit with our listeners, give us a bit of context as to why what Archie's doing is so unusual.
This whole concept of public money for public goods that has really been strongly sold after Brexit as something that government wants to hang farm subsidy schemes around. Archie's one of those guys who is just trying to paint all shades of colour onto that concept. And he's a real innovator and experimenter, but he's a supremely technically knowledgeable environmentalist as well as being a farmer. And so the kind of things that he's doing, I think, are identifying opportunities for really groundbreaking ways of managing land and water and getting incredible outcomes out of that.
Let's hear from Archie. Let's head to Spain's Hall in Essex. So I'm here today at Spain's Hall Estate, a typical classic English countryside landscape. And yet what they're doing at Spain's is anything but traditional. So let's go meet Archie Ruggles-Brise and find out a bit more about it.
So we are currently sort of in the middle of the estate.
Mm-hmm.
All right, the estate covers about 2,000 acres, so it's about 860 hectares. The majority of it, so about 660 of it, is currently cropped. So it's currently very conventional arable farm. Mm-hmm. We're in East Anglia, so that means big fields, kind of little hedges around the fields, ditches around every field, and until quite recently, the makeup of the farm was that we have 4 farming tenants. So we have multi-generational tenants on some parts of it. So essentially these are people that we let the land to. So as far as I'm concerned, that's kind of their land. We own it, but they manage it. Right. So this is quite an interesting bit here. So we're driving down towards the 2019 beaver enclosure. On our left is a very large kind of open field, and you can see maize stubble on here. So we used to rent this to a farmer, and in their final year what they decided to do was grow quite a lot of maize for biofuel.
It's really interesting for me that farmland, they're already choosing to grow an energy crop rather than a food crop as well. So actually when we think about what you're doing here, which is arguably a bit different and taking some land out of food production. Actually, even with conventional farming, sounds like that's already happening anyway for some fields.
Yeah, it is, but you've got to remember this is a rotation. All the farmers on the estate use rotations to manage disease, they manage weed burdens. So when you see reports saying, well, we need to put this amount of land over to X, it kind of forgets that there's a rotation in there.
Right, Archie, tell us where we are and what we're about to see.
Okay, so we're standing outside the beaver enclosure we created in 2019. The interesting thing is that this is, if I show you the map here, we're quite on the edge of the estate. Mm-hmm. All right, so this was a piece of woodland that was not massively productive for timber. We are then sitting within an existing landscape that's mainly farmed. We have a plan you're looking at here, which is it looks like a hallucinogenic nightmare.
I think somebody looks like they've knitted it, if I'm perfectly honest with you. I'm pretty sure I might see that on a jumper at some point, but no, go for it. We'll share a photograph of it, actually, I think, along with the show notes. It's fascinating. So yeah, go and explain it all to us.
I think describing it as a knitted diagram is something I'm going to steal. That's an amazing way of putting it. So you've got stripes. So every single one of our arable fields at the moment, the future is stripy for it. So at the moment, you generally get the environmental bits go around the outside. Mm-hmm. So you get set-asides or you get wildflower mixes or something like that, delivered under countryside stewardship or a similar scheme. But that tends to stick around the edge, and they tend to square off fields so that you get the commodity crop, the cash crop, going in the middle. Yeah. And the reason for that is you've got, under current land use systems, you've really only got two ways you can make money out of the land. It's either by extracting something, so it's extracting grain or some kind of crop or straw, or it's getting a government subsidy for not extracting it. So there's only two things really you can do on it. What we're doing here is developing a completely different system that has multiple revenue streams built around multiple ecosystem services. So each field is now split up, or will be split up, into rows of trees, quite widely spaced apart. We're going to be growing fruit and nuts on those trees, so that's agroforestry. Mm-hmm. In between those rows, conventionally, what you'd do is you'd go back to doing cropping. So you'd grow your crop of wheat between these widely spaced rows. What we're doing is trying to flip the premise on its head and say, we're going to put the food production on the trees. So we're lifting it up out of the ground. That's a permanent crop. It's going to be there for anywhere between 20 and 100 years. So you don't get the kind of tillage problems and the sort of degradation of soil. Between those rows, we're going to do a very large-scale countryside stewardship scheme. Mm-hmm. So we are going to be using that same income stream from the government to put different habitats between each of those tree rows. The principle of diversity is the thing that underpins it. My diversity looks like this because I've decided it looks like this, whereas anyone else's land use can be something totally different. And I think that's something that policy really struggles with. It's that element of choice.
I think that balance between how prescriptive you are and freedom of choice is a really interesting one. I'd like to explore it a bit more as we carry on through the pod. But I can see a beaver enclosure over my shoulder, and Archie knows that I am overly excited about seeing these guys, or at least seeing what they've been up to. So should we go and have a look?
Starts here. You might just be able to see a silver trap in the distance. Yeah. Goes all the way past that. That's their lodge. So that's where they'll be at the moment.
I'm glad I bought my wellies.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So I'm looking at what's really just a massive pile of logs and sticks in the middle of a beautiful little pond. And Archie was just explaining that before the beavers, this was a tiny stream, maybe half a metre wide.
So we put a pair of beavers into this 10-acre enclosure on the 14th of March 2019.
So not far off 4 years, and there's now, around 2.5 megalitres worth of water stored behind their dam, maybe a bit more. And what's gone from a half metre wide channel is now, a really decent sized little lake, really, isn't it? With this beautiful beaver dam in the middle of it. It's, they've been busy beavers.
So we're standing in front of the main kind of beaver pond, if you like. So they build a pond around their lodge so that it protects them from predators. There aren't any predators in this country, but they don't know that. Mm-hmm. They raise the water level up so that they can transport things around. So you can see there's some fairly large pieces of wood on top of that lodge. Mm. They float them around just like we do. And this is one of 4 or 5 dams this size. So this dam is probably 40 metres long, 50 metres long. Generally speaking, it's anywhere between kind of 20 centimetres and almost 2 metres high, depending on the topography. And there are now a series of pools in this woodland. a pool and then a run and then a pool and then a run and then a pool. If you look at it from the ground, it feels like you're walking up a canal because the height level changes and things like this. So it's a really diverse system. When the rain comes down, the water comes through here and it just gets slowed through each of these pools. So that, from the flood management perspective, is what we wanted to achieve. Yeah. So you slow the flow, you also trap a lot of the sediment, because this drains a lot of our fields, which still conventionally farmed. It drains the roads, it drains the tracks. There's a load of stuff coming in here. It traps some of that, cleans the water. You get a lot of vegetation growing in the peripheral areas of these ponds. You can see there's lots of reeds coming up here. There's lots of freshwater mint. All of this uses up nutrients. So you've got excess phosphate and nitrate in here, which are feeding these plants, rather than carrying on downstream to then have to be cleaned out by the water companies. We are providing a resource for things that live in our landscape that wasn't here before. So in terms of biodiversity, wildlife, there is no value to the things that have now taken up residence here. So these are things that we don't get paid for. Things we do get paid for: people coming and visiting, potentially the ability to access future grants or support and things like that. But it's all quite hard work, and it's something that you have to really be motivated to do.
All right, Archie, so we are stood next to what looks like a really big wooden bridge and some logs going across the stream, which I would imagine is a leaky dam. But tell me all, what are we standing next to start off with?
So yeah, we are standing next to a leaky dam. This is one of the 8 leaky dams we put in as the other half of the original 2019 natural flood management project. So the other half is the beavers and this was the man-made stuff. So we were trying to compare one with the other, and we're very lucky. We've got a sort of number of research partnerships, including with King's College London, who are helping us do that measurement, because we're really trying to get a handle on the outcome of this stuff. So, measuring how effective it is. So at the moment, the water is trickling underneath it without any impediments at all. It's not holding it up, it's not creating an impoundment. The water is just running through this leaky dam without any problem at all. When the channel fills up, then it creates a 10 or 20 centimetre difference in level upstream to downstream. That's enough to push the water out onto the old floodplain.
Just walking over to meet Arno van Soesbergen, who is standing in a field next to all sorts of scientific equipment. Let's go and find out what he's doing.
We're monitoring lots of different things around here. So the stations that you see here on the left is monitoring pollution. So at the top it's monitoring light pollution, but it's also monitoring noise pollutions. And then underneath it is audio ecology monitoring device, rainfall monitoring device. The things that we have analysed is the natural flood management, particularly the leaky dams. We found that they were quite successful in slowing the flow down. They certainly do have an impact on peak flows and reducing that peak. But you can see a difference in water levels, for instance, of about 10-20 centimeters if there is a big rainfall event. We're also monitoring the beaver enclosure that's already in existence. There is a lot of water being stored there.
So beavers are more effective than leaky dams?
I would say so, yes.
So one of the really cool things that happens is that the flood level data gets fed into a disaster model that King's College have built in order to allow the insurance industry to get a handle on the cost benefit of natural flood management. So it's about trying to transfer that benefit from where it originates to where it's felt and back again, in order to underpin this idea that there is a different way, there is a different model for land use, but you have to recognise its components and you have to recognise the value of it.
Yeah. Should we say a bit more?
Yeah.
Let's go. Okay, Archie, so we've come through a few fields and we're now parked in the corner of an absolutely ginormous field that looks like it's got loads of tree poles in it. What are we here for and what's going on?
So we're standing in one of our first agroforestry fields. So we're looking out, as you say, in quite a big field. You can see some woodlands in the distance. We're just off the road. What you can really see, what draws your eye at the moment, is we've got no crop in here. So we've got a load of stubble, but we can see every 7 metres there's a tree. So what we've done is we've planted a mixture of oak and nut trees in these rows. Between each of these rows there will be a different habitat. Okay. So rather than the moment where you've got a bit of kind of scrubby stuff around the outside and then you've got your crop in the middle, which is quite a hostile environment to wildlife. Yeah. If you were a small spider or something, getting from one side of this field to another would be your life's work. Yeah. Whereas what we need to do is try and provide different habitats and different food sources across the landscape. So this is where the sort of policy drives you in a certain direction. So the things that are available to us are countryside stewardship. And countryside stewardship is an actions-based system. You have to do certain things in return for certain amounts of money. There aren't many options currently within it, and there are a few coming out of the new LM programme, but it's still pretty managed. If we had a system that rewarded the underlying outputs of this, then we could potentially be much more hands-off. Because if you don't manage things, then perhaps we can still get the benefits of increasing soil carbon, slowing and cleaning water, providing homes for biodiversity and things like that. You could probably start focusing on measuring those things and not focusing on delivering the prescriptions of the scheme. But that's where we're at currently. So this is a bit of a hybrid scheme that kind of works for us.
All right, so we are back out in the cold again, but that's all right. In another ginormous field, this time just looks like grassland to my untrained eye, with a nice field boundary with some mature trees. So what's happening here, Archie?
So where you're actually standing is a field called wood ground, and we're standing in a hole in our ancient woodland. So what you can actually see on our left and on our right are two different chunks of woodland, ancient woodland. So we're very lucky, having been on the estate for a very long time, we've got some really old maps. So we've got a hand-drawn map from 1618 which shows a lot of woodland, it shows a lot of trees in our landscape, in the fields and things, so we're taking that as our inspiration. And one of the things we noticed on that map is where we're standing now was woodland. So we're going to put it back to woodland.
Wow. So, what's happening on the right-hand side? We've got looks like a fenced-off area in a field of not a lot, Archie. So what's going on?
So at the moment it's not a lot. It will have lines of trees in it, like the rest of it. We just haven't planted them in this field. And what we've done is fenced off one of the alleys, the bits between the trees, and we're using that for a kind of micro tree nursery. So we've collected a load of acorns and a load of walnuts and a load of other things from the farm, and we're going to be growing those from seed, mainly for our own use so that we can support future planting programmes, but potentially also then to sell them to people in the future if we have too many.
Right, so we're back at the estate office. Let's go in and have a cup of tea, get warm, and find out a little bit more about why Archie and the team here at Spain's are doing all of this work. Planet Possible is sponsored by CIWEM, who are at the forefront of innovation, collaboration, digital excellence and customer experience. They help to enable their customers to continuously improve operational efficiencies whilst recognising the importance of and addressing industry-wide challenges such as climate change, the journey to net zero and regularly evolving regulation. At their heart, CIWEM believe collaboration with customers and industry partners is fundamental to building transformative solutions across the utility sector that ultimately benefit their customers, the consumer and our environment. Okay, Archie, so we've come back in the warm, which I'm grateful for. Let's get into why you're doing all this. You're obviously doing something really quite different. We've seen some fantastic stuff going on site this morning, but why?
For me, it's just trying to answer all those questions. You know, we're lucky enough to have some land that we can do things on, and looking further forward, you know, we think about things in multi-generation. So I'm looking at, you know, what is the next generation going to be left with? What are the challenges they're going to face? And for me, you know, the challenge of climate change and the challenge of the biodiversity crisis and the challenge of getting people excited about where they live and keeping people in our local community are things that I really think we need to do something about. It really started when we had a natural capital appraisal done with some partners at Atkins, and we started to see some of the downsides of what we were currently doing. So it wasn't all about just thinking what could we do, what are the good things. It was also exposing some risks.
What were some of the downsides? What were you seeing?
One of the things, we modelled some of our arable operation, and we worked out that on a small subset of the farm we were losing something in the region of 9 tonnes of soil a year, and that there were a number of tonnes of ammonia going into the rivers and nitrates and things like that. If you take a step back and you think, okay, what are our risks? You know, this is our most valuable asset and we're allowing it to disappear. And also, what are the risks? You know, in future, the regulation might be that actually we have to pay for and account for those pollutants that get into the environment. So looking at it from a kind of pure risk management perspective, it was thinking we need to try and find a different way of doing this. But also then my desire to try and push the envelope and try and understand what is possible.
Perfect for our podcast. We're always a big fan of what's possible. So thinking about our audience, you know, lots of CIWEM members are water professionals in particular. They may come into contact with agricultural land, but only occasionally. Certainly if you work in the world of bioresources, then there's a connection. But apart from that, it's often not as obvious. So you've talked a lot about this being a different land use model and talked about lots of beneficiaries. Help me understand who they are and how it links to things like the water sector, for example.
So I've got an affinity with the water sector. So I started off my career working for a water company, and then I worked for the Rivers Trust movement for a long time, and now I'm managing land. So water is the sort of unifying theme for me. But the other things that we have that we could potentially enter into markets if the markets are available are things like carbon sequestration, both below ground and above ground in vegetation. They are biodiversity gain. We're working through the biodiversity net gain credits pilot, and we're actually in a position now to supply biodiversity units to developers and others that need them. There's also the water element is really important, and that's one of the things that I'm really keen to try and explore. So we did a piece of work with Atkins to try and understand both the high flows and the low flows impacts of land use change on our farm. So normally flood risk modelers model too much water, and water resource modelers model too little water in this part of the world. What I wanted to do was try and glue them both together, and the experts at Atkins helped us do that, and we've come out with some really important figures. So we know, for example, that we can potentially contribute another 5 to 10% of base flow during summer periods. Now that's significant when you think that most of our rivers don't have any water running in them for anything up to 6-7 months of the year. Right. 5 or 10% more means there might be water in the river, whereas there isn't. We're also part of the ELU's transfer scheme, so one of the existing water transfers in the country, which pumps vast amounts of water from the Wash down to South Essex through our river catchment. Now that's a very expensive, very carbon intensive process. So if we can offset some of that pumping cost by providing water back into the system, which is then available further downstream, then potentially there's a saving there as well. On the other side of the coin, all these things that we're doing, we reckon we can reduce flood risk to our local community by somewhere between 15 and 30%, depending on the return period of the flood. So we're starting to get some quite significant numbers here. But it's also revealed a load of other stuff on the estate. So we modelled what the soil could store. So if we manage the soil under this sort of low intervention system, there is somewhere between 5,500 and 8,500 megalitres of storage in our soil.
That's a huge number. 5,500 megalitres, is that what you said?
Yeah.
Good grief.
So it's somewhere between 6 and 10 megalitres per hectare.
Wow.
And we're not special. So we're a really bog standard farming estate. There's nothing we're doing here. I mean, all right, you can't necessarily pump that out and use it in the way you could a resource, but it will help to contribute to that base flow. It will help increase the resilience of the landscape. It also potentially means that there is more resource available from other sources if that resource is not being taken up by our land. With this water study, the guys at Atkins looked around and said, well, you do realise that every single field you've got has got a ditch around it. I was like, yeah, of course, I see them every day. Yeah. Have you ever measured them? Well, no, why would we? They're just there, they're part of the landscape. And they said, okay, well, we reckon you've got 85 kilometres of ditches.
Good grief.
Kilometres of ditches.
And what are we, 2,000 acres as a farm?
2,000 acres as a farm,
yeah.
85 kilometres of ditches. And so I was like, wow, well, that's a measure we've never had before.
Yeah.
What can we do with that? And they said, well, okay, what we've also done is, because they all have a fairly standard cross-section, is we've worked out, on average, how much that storage is. And they reckon that you can get 1 megalitre of water stored in 1 kilometre of ditch.
Wow.
So now, 1 megalitre of water doesn't sound a huge amount. 85 megalitres of water, suddenly you're starting to talk about numbers that are significant. There are trade-offs inherent in that, because if we flooded our ditches, then it would make the surrounding land different. It would make it wetter. It would make it less suitable for other things. And this is where you start to come into these trade-offs. It's like, right, okay, how much is that worth to me? So how much benefit do I accrue from that water? But also then, how much is that beneficial to somebody else? And you can start to have, if you've got figures like this, you can start to have really interesting conversations with, say, for example, the water sector, and say, okay, well, if I can store this resource and I can bridge that period, from one of the other things we found during the study is that we have a water deficit on the farm for anything up to about 6 months a year. And that period is getting slowly longer. So we're getting into water deficit from the middle of April through to kind of middle of November, and it's edging. We did it over decadal timescale, so we know it's kind of edging wider. What can we do to bridge that gap, both for our own benefit, so my trees and my crops need water, but also the local environment needs water, and the water resources that get put into the possible water supply, that's all really important. But also then the other end of the spectrum is, how do we stop the increasing flood risk to our local community. So, it's trying to glue all these things together and come at it from a holistic approach, which is why it's sort of all we try and do is this basket of outcomes. So it's not looking at it and designing a thing for flood risks necessarily or for biodiversity, although we are getting into projects like that. But what we try and do is bring in all of these outcomes together.
So one thing I'm interested in is, how do you make the choices that you've made? How do you decide what to do with that land? I'm really struck by the variety that we've seen today. We've seen agroforestry, we've seen woodland creation, we've seen beavers, we've seen leaky dams. There's probably things that I've missed. I feel like we've seen so much this morning. How did you make those decisions? And in general, how should we make those decisions about the right thing, the best thing to do for the land? Is that even a thing that exists?
I think this is the challenge that you've got, is that everyone's Rubik's Cube is different, and it's composed of different blocks, and what their expertise is going to be different. And I think that's the really difficult challenge for policy and for practice, is to allow people that flexibility to make their own decisions, but then have a structure in place that both measures and rewards the outcomes from that. So it doesn't matter how you put it together, the overall trend is positive in terms of improving. So I have to take a decision based on my gut feel as to what challenges we're going to be faced. And I have a responsibility to try and make sure that this business and this land can still be productive in 100 years' time. So you kind of, at some point, you have to go, no, I'm going to do something differently. And that's the same for every business. There's that sort of tipping point where you go, okay, the risks of not doing something outweigh the risks of doing something. Now, I may have jumped too soon. I may be doing things that prove not to work, but my satisfaction will come from trying to do something and not sitting there and then being at the whim of, climatic conditions or policy changes or anything. I'd rather be at the front trying to shape it for the benefit of everyone else.
If your farm was 4,000 acres, does this still work? Is this an interesting hobby project, Archie, or is this something that's genuinely scalable?
It's a good question. I think it's probably, to go bigger, this gets better. To go smaller, that's where the challenge lies. So most farming businesses, the majority of land holdings in the UK are 85 hectares is the average size. Get down to the West Country, it's smaller. You get over to East Anglia, it's a bit bigger.
And in hectares, yours is?
860. So, we are relatively large in the States. I'm not making changes over that whole period. So a whole piece, I'm making changes over about 500 hectares, including the woodlands. What I think you can do on any size of landholding is interject a bit of diversity. It's just how you manage those different revenue streams. And I think one of the common things here, that it's less about the sort of productive element of it, because production of crops or food and things like that does have a sort of de minimis level where below which you can't specialise anymore, or you are reliant entirely on the ability of the farmer to direct sell to the consumer, which some people are brilliant at and some people aren't. It's just the way it is. But the underlying ecosystem service things, it almost doesn't matter how big you are, because you will always get some outcome that can be measured. It might be marginal. It needs that kind of structural element to it.
As we start to sort of wrap up, Archie, one of the things that we've touched on a little bit as we've been out and about on site is the complexity and the silos that exist with all of these different schemes and approaches. So, you are thinking about biodiversity net gain, for example. You're thinking there's different subsidies available. From your perspective as the landowner, you're thinking about a whole farm approach, but arguably you're probably the only person that is. How do you finance? How do you make this kind of model sustainable, given the degree of complexity that sits outside of your farm?
It's a really good question. I spend a lot of my time trying to find those opportunities for things like countryside stewardship schemes. So the bits that we're putting down that we're not farming, we're putting down to kind of rotational biodiversity crops. That's just an off-the-shelf scheme. So that's a revenue-based scheme that's available to anybody. The more unusual elements of the scheme that we're doing, so things like creating a new beaver enclosure and things like that, that's where some of these really interesting conversations come out. And if you've got the ability to recognise what the benefits are, then you can have conversations with, so the people that funded our new beaver enclosure there's 2 water companies, the Environment Agency, Regional Flood and Coastal Committee, and local authority. And each one of them have come in on a slightly different reason. So one of the water companies has found money through a WINEP programme because it delivers the biodiversity outcomes and the river restoration they want.
That's the Water Industry National Environment Programme,
Yep. The other one has come in through a partnership funding surface water flooding problem that they've got, and it's a route to sort that, but they've also got a pledge to improve river environment, so it kind of ticked 2 boxes for them. That's really good. The local authority have come in because we're delivering on aims of their Climate Action Commission, and also there is a flood risk benefit. They're a lead local flood authority, so it kind of works for them. And the Regional Flood and Coastal Committee come in because it's delivering natural flood management, which is in line with the Floods and Water Act, and also delivers a risk reduction to property. So it's about finding mechanisms and understanding enough about the counterparties you want to deal with to be able to understand why it's useful for them. And there are some industries that we really haven't been able to crack. So the insurance industry is one. You know, we're not there yet. We think we can make a pretty good play into that and say, listen, we can reduce risk going forward. But the insurance industry is not ready to recognise that yet. And the scale we can operate at is probably not big enough to kind of feature on their radar.
Archie, I could chat for hours, and I suspect you could too, really, on this kind of stuff. But as we draw it to a close, I always ask guests one final question. We've talked a lot about some of the challenges, obstacles that you're facing, really. If I was to pass you the Planet Possible magic wand, what would you want to make possible?
I thought a lot about this one, and there's so many things that I would love to wave a magic wand, but I think the one underlying thing that would benefit all land managers and society as a whole would be the recognition of outcomes. That would be it. I think that's it. If you can measure them and you can reward people in proportion to the success of delivering those outcomes, then all of the other problems go away, because you have value in places where you're generating value and you don't have value in places where it's irrelevant. And I think that would be it.
That's a great note to end on. Archie, it was an absolute pleasure to see you today. Thank you so much for sharing the work that you're doing here at Spain's Hall with us all.
Thank you.
So, Al, what were your initial reflections from the visit to Spain's and the interview we've just heard?
I think the thing that surprised me was actually how much of the farm that he said was still just being very conventionally farmed. So when I've spoken to Archie before, you know, I got the impression that the whole thing was going to be this kind of sandbox and lab of different kind of things. But actually, over 60%, I think he said, was just very conventionally farmed, and he's trying to move the rest of it into a different way of farming with a lot more agroforestry and those kind of approaches. So it's not that what he's doing is completely outlandish and unrealistic to translate to other farms. I think, you know, he's obviously doing it in quite a concerted way. He's very driven and passionate about trying to try all kinds of different things. And in some ways, I guess, you know, he's quite lucky to have the ability to do that, and not every farmer will be in a similar position. But at the same time, he's not an anomaly in the sense of what he's doing, what he's managing, and the conditions that he has to work with. He's still got to run a profitable farm business.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. He was really focused, wasn't he, on the fact that it is still a business. You know, this isn't a charity and I need to make it stand up. So let's talk a little bit about water, because so much of what we saw, the beavers, the leaky dams, the natural flood management, had really obvious connections to water. But there's a bigger role, I think, that water can play here. So tell me what some of your reflections are on the opportunities for water with Archie's approach.
So obviously Archie is doing different kinds of natural flood management, and the beavers was the really glitzy example of that. But he's got leaky dams and other things that he's doing, and he's looking at blocking up ditches along his farm. So he's got 85 odd kilometres of ditches, and he can effectively play tunes with how he manages those from a water perspective. I think one of the challenges that came across from the perspective of what he's trying to do is, you know, Archie has a background in water management, and he's able to bring his knowledge of that landscape and of where different pots of money exist and harness those to be able to finance some of the things that he's doing. And so with the work that he did around natural flood management, he got funding from the local authority because there's a local flood risk to the local village. He got funding through the Regional Flood and Coastal Committee and from a water company. He was able to stitch those together effectively to give him the means to deliver that scheme. Now, I don't think that's something that all farmers can easily do. And I asked him about that, and he said that kind of advisory service or brokering service to help farmers and land managers access the different, quite disparate pots of money that exist out there to be able to deliver some of these public goods that they can then potentially get returns for, especially if we do start to be able to hang values off outcomes. That's really challenging. And I think in order to open this kind of approach up and really make it happen at a much wider scale, those kind of enablers, those kind of advice services and brokerage services, I think could be really powerful and helpful. So that was one thing. The other thing related to the work that he's been doing in relation to the whole farm reservoir concept, which was quite fascinating and really resonated with me because it was something that I was looking at a little bit from a conceptual perspective back in the summer when farmers and rivers were being really badly impacted by the drought.
So tell me a bit more about the kind of the whole farm reservoir approach and where we think there is an opportunity, if in fact there is there.
Bear with me because I'm going to do a bit of thinking aloud here. Archie he got this study done. He got this assessment of how much water is stored within the soil, within the land on his farm. Now, he's got a 2,000 acre farm, which give or take is about 10 times the size of the average UK farm. But he can store in his soil, as it is at the moment, about 5,500 megalitres, which is 5,500 million litres of water. And potentially, if he was to do some fancy land management interventions, he could maybe get that up to 8,500 megalitres, I think he said. Now, just for context, in the UK, we use about 14 billion litres of water a day. So that's 14,000 megalitres of water every day. Kielder Water Reservoir up in the northeast, that's the UK's largest reservoir. That's got a capacity of 200 billion litres of water, so 200,000 megalitres. Buell Water in Kent is 31,000 megalitres, and Colliford Reservoir, which is in Cornwall, and it's a reservoir where everyone's getting really worried because it's less than half full. Cornwall's still in drought status, and they're really worried about the future. This summer, from a drought perspective, that's 28,500 megalitres. So Archie's farm alone can store 5.5, potentially up to 8.5. So I looked into this, as I said, last summer. King's College London have done some research on soil water storage associated with regenerative farming techniques, and they did these side-by-side field trials. Actually, they were looking at natural flood management and not at this from a water resources perspective, but they found out that on the average sized farm, so that's an 86 hectare farm, you could store an extra 67 megalitres on one of those farms more in just 1 week if soils were farmed regeneratively compared to just kind of conventional farming. Now, the National Infrastructure Commission, so they're an advisor to government, they've told government that they need to put in place or ensure that plans are in place to provide an extra 4,000 megalitres per day nationally by 2050. So that's about 28,000 megalitres a week. So what that works out at is about 457 regeneratively farmed average size farms worth, I guess, in terms of water. Now, there's 192,000 farms in the UK. So if you do the really crude maths on that, you get to a figure of something like 12.8 million megalitres of water in 1 week, just that could conceptually be stored through better soil health. Now, obviously, that you've got to take my science and maths here with a huge pinch of salt. And as Archie says in the interview, you can't necessarily access that water that's held in the soil, but a lot of it can be available for plants. Some of it will infiltrate the soil and the bedrocks and support aquifer recharge and river base flows and stuff like that. And we know how much rivers and agriculture suffer when we get in droughts. We saw that really graphically last summer. So what this says to me is that when people start getting up in arms about drought prospects and how many reservoirs haven't been built in recent decades, maybe we need to be thinking far more outside the box here. If we manage our land differently, if we help farmers get over that productivity dip that there is with regenerative farming for a few years in strategically important parts of the country, you know, upstream of reservoirs, in places where base flow in rivers is crucial, or there needs to be better aquifer recharge, we could put a real dent in the water resources gap potentially through these kind of approaches. And obviously, at the same time, we'd be doing a great thing for nature. Now, like, I may be barking up the wrong tree here, and it would be great if people got in touch with us, frankly, to dig into this a bit more. But I just feel that there's so much orthodoxy in our land and water management policy and frameworks at the moment that we're barely scratching the surface of what could be possible from this kind of landscape scale, integrated water resource and flood risk management kind of nature-based solutions perspective. Now, I've had conversations with people, and people who know a thing or two about this kind of approach, and actually who are really close to water companies, or one water company in particular, they've said to me that if this was done in that water company patch at a landscape scale, they would pretty much crack the drought and flood issues that they're facing at the moment. So my question really is, where's Rebecca Powell, the water minister's? Where's her thinking on this? Where's DEFRA's thinking on this? Where even is Ofwat and the environment agencies? Absolutely recognise that my numbers are probably really out of whack, but they're so big that surely it deserves a closer look. And this whole farm reservoir concept needs some examination.
I guess the other thing that you've made me think is it's not just about the volume of water that's stored, but it's also about slowing the flow through the landscape. So from a river water quality perspective, actually not leaching perhaps quite as much nutrients into the rivers, for example. So there's additional benefits, I guess, aren't there, to slowing the flow in the landscape alongside actually storing more water. So all of that sounds extraordinary. If we said that was the direction of travel, what would need to happen to shift towards it? What do you need to get it going?
Well, something needs to better link up water resources thinking, planning, the way that we just look at thinking about water resources. Same for flood risk management, same for farm management and the environmental land management scheme. Stitch these together more effectively in a more integrated way. I think there are conversations happening within government about how that might be possible. And of course, we have river basin management plans, we have catchment flood management plans, we have catchment partnerships. The seeds of this exist. I think we need to put them on some kind of steroids and really capture the potential that they do point towards. We've barely scratched the surface. We don't know exactly what the potential is. But I think it's really, really quite great. It's just there's no data, or there's not an extensive database to back that up yet. But, given the pressures that we're facing, I think we need to get really quite innovative and ambitious about the areas that we explore. And this definitely needs a lot more examination, I think.
I guess my final question, what I was considering was really, do the policies and the frameworks exist? And you've sort of touched on that a little bit. I was also thinking about incentives. Do we need more incentives to shift towards this? Do they exist yet?
No, I don't think on this kind of scale. So there are measures being put into the environmental land management scheme to encourage farmers to adopt certain land management practice, standards within the sustainable farming incentive, for example. But, Archie mentioned his magic wand thing was to be able to measure outcomes. And one of the things he's spoken a lot about is monitoring and measuring outcomes and being able to track them. And over time, building up an evidence base that says, yes, if you do this intervention, it's pretty likely that if it's done in the right way, it will deliver these kind of outcomes. We'll monitor that, and then we can be sure that we can pay a farmer or a land manager accordingly to deliver it, because we know it's going to unlock X benefit for downstream communities or for a reservoir that's downstream or a chalk stream. It's these kind of things that we really need to get a lot more sophisticated about, I think.
So for the final time this season, Al, let me pass across the Planet Possible magic wand. I don't normally ask co-hosts, but I'd quite like to hear what you would do with the Planet Possible magic wand, given all that we heard and we both saw in practice at Spain's. If you could make anything possible in this space to change something, what would that be?
I would like the Water Minister to really look in depth at what could be unlocked by radically improving the way that we manage soils in this country. I think from a carbon point of view, a water point of view, both flood and drought, there's huge potential there that, we just don't really understand at the moment. And it's something that needs a lot of investigation and attention.
Well, that's a perfect point to end, although I feel like it's only the beginning of a conversation, and I'm definitely up for a podcast on soils at some point. Al, thank you so much for joining us. As ever, time flies by when we do these pods. Here we are at the end of the episode, but also at the end of another season of Planet Possible. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for your ratings, thank you for your reviews, and thank you for helping us to top the Earth Sciences podcast charts as well. I really hope you found the conversations insightful. I hope they've given you something to think about in your world too. You can subscribe to Planet Possible on your usual podcast player to never miss an episode. And if you have missed any previous episodes, definitely head back and catch them. Just one more thing to tell you about before we go. On Planet Possible, we talk a lot about innovation, but we also like to innovate ourselves. We've partnered with a new technology called Accordion that lets you take control of the length of a podcast whilst keeping the tone, structure and feel of the original. So if you want to catch up on our previous episodes in a really time-efficient way, or maybe you've not got the time to listen to the full version of the latest episode, just go to accordion.live/Planet Possible and you can listen at a length that suits the time you have available. That's accordion.live/Planet Possible. All that leaves me to say is a huge thank you to our guest today, Archie Ruggles-Brise, and my excellent co-host, Alistair Chisholm. Thank you, Al.
Thanks, Niki.
That's it, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.
Planet Possible is produced by Bulb. BWLB Bulb. The best ideas, the strongest content.